Good morning. Thank you all for joining us again for this month's edition of Coffee Talk. My name is Sean O'Brien, President of QwickRate. And as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve is our Director of Analytics here at QwickAnalytics. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sean. Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Huntington. I've been working with Sean at QwickRate for just about a decade or so now, but my background is working with community banks all over the country, pretty much for my entire career, everything from strategic planning and valuation work to M&A advisory, capital planning, model design and maintenance. So pretty much I've been working with institutions like y'all for my entire career, and spent the last bit of time here trying to take a lot of that experience and those models and that analytics and put it into an environment that that community banks could make better use of.
Great, thanks, Steve. Just a reminder today, the format is many of you know for being repeat attendees, so thank you for that. We are using Zoom, and probably the most effective way is to use the Q&A box in the chat. We will monitor those throughout the presentation. Again, the format for any of those of you who are new to the Coffee Talks is a little bit less presentation, a little bit more interactive questions. So we certainly encourage you to utilize the chat and Q&A features, and we will take those questions as they come in or at an appropriate break in the discussion. Secondly, we will send out a link to today's recording. I did start the recording this month, so I think we'll be good there. And also a copy of the slide deck. What we've found, and I appreciate the feedback we've gotten from you, our users, but CECL is going to be a process. We don't, and nor do I think the regulators expect everybody to be perfect from day one. But we felt like as a way to support you as you make your transition was to do these monthly discussions where we could talk about topics not only related to the CECLSolver itself, but now as all of you are starting to dig into it and begin to run parallel, a lot of our conversations will probably shift a little bit more towards maybe challenges you're encountering, questions you have, now that you're kind of digging in. And so again, we'll continue to talk a little bit about the tool, but now, and I would encourage you certainly going forward, if there's, areas of the tool you'd like us to discuss further, please do that. But some of the topics we'll discuss today are some of the questions we, seem to be getting as we, speak with you as you begin kind of that parallel run process. So all of this is designed to, again, just provide another area of support. We will continue these through next year. Next month as well, Paul Allen from Saltmarsh will join us again. For those of you might remember earlier this spring, Paul joined us. It was a great coffee talk. He's going to come back on next month. So again, we're going to continue to try to support you as best we can, not only through customer service, but by providing some hopefully helpful content in these coffee talks. So again, I know. Let me just see if we got a quick question here. All right, we got a question on prepayment speeds. We're going to cover that again today. So actually, I'm going to hold that one for now. But Steve, if you just want to make a few comments here about the tool. Again, most of you know this pretty well, but we may have some new attendees on. So we'll be brief with this. But Steve, just want to touch on these.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. That's not my forte. Typically, I apologize that there's a little bit of background noise. Seems all the landscapers are out in mass. It's a sign of the times, and there's some serious leaf blowers going on in the background. But for those of you who are less familiar with our tool, our CECLSolver tool is based heavily on the weighted average remaining maturity, or the WARM method, with some elements of open pool snapshot as well. The entire tool lives in the cloud, meaning it's an interactive environment. When you first log on to use our tool, all of your historical data is preloaded into the system. Because we start our segmentation around what we can get from the call reports, your entire history of charge-offs, recoveries, past dues, loan balances by call report segment are already preloaded into the system. We get questions all the time, especially around this time of year or around this time of the quarter. When do we update the data? As soon as your call report is filed, then your current balances will update. And as soon as everybody else has finished filing at the end of that first month, so pretty much right around like the last day of October, first day in November is when we'll have a complete data set for all the third quarter filings. And that's when the entire universe of historical data and trends gets updated for 930 data. But the way, again, the way the tool works, you can save scenarios, you can generate all different types of exports that you'd like using the tool, but it lives in a subscription-based environment where you simply log on and work on it with your team. Next slide. Yeah, so this is sort of already kind of pointed it out. One of the best practices we have is throughout the tool, we allow you and highly encourage note taking, right? There's multiple 2 or 3 or 4 areas within the tool where you can make notes pertinent to that part of the tool at the segment level. This is critical for the documentation that you need in an audit or in an exam. And even if you're not making notes for external purposes, you're going to want to have an idea next time when you pull it up next month or next quarter to update the tool and save a new scenario. You know, what were you thinking last quarter when you made this 40 basis point adjustment based upon peer data or based upon economic data? So it's good not only in order to justify and build that narrative around your assumptions from an external standpoint, but also just from maintaining the tool and reminding yourself on an ongoing basis what assumptions you have and have not made.
Steve, I had a question come in that this kind of applies to what you're discussing here.
Sure.
If they amend a previous call report, the question is, will we catch that data?
Yes, we will. So we don't pull call reports on a quarterly basis. We pull call reports on a daily basis. So every single call report filed in the United States on a nightly basis gets into our system the night after it's available from the FDIC. So that includes not only, you know, during the filing period, but also after the filing period. And it never ceases to amaze me how many institutions do refile on a nightly basis. Even let's say last night, right? We're in the middle of a period right now, not very popular, but we still probably had 10 or 15 banks refile a call report just last night. So yes, we pick them up on a daily basis and update not only a CECL tool, but our entire platform as soon as that happens.
Great, thank you. I want to touch on the scale tool briefly again. This is just
very briefly. Last year, I guess a little over a year now ago, the Fed came out with the scale tool. They immediately sort of mentioned that this is not a safe harbor. This is not guaranteed, quote, to pass regulatory or auditing muster. But I think they wanted to throw community banks a bone, so to speak. They wanted to provide some sort of help and guidance, even if it only just sort of furthered our belief and understanding that relatively straightforward methodologies can certainly be appropriate. But the Fed scale tool, it was enough that we felt like we should build it and have it as an alternative within our platform, even if it's just a sanity check or kind of a backup methodology, something to compare your primary CECL methodology, like our CECLSolver against. Now, the scale tool certainly has a number of significant limitations, most probably important of which are the very small amount of segmentation, right? That data that we're getting to calculate everything under scale is limited to 6 segments, 6 buckets for your entire loan portfolio. And we start with looking at peer data, or peers loosely termed here. It's larger banks over $1 billion in assets that fill out that disaggregated loan loss reserve data every quarter on their call reports now. That's sort of the starting point for the scale tool, assuming you're going to perform like your bigger peers, and then kind of modify to get it close and to let everyone know why you might be different than your peers. So, you know, conceptually, it's a little bit, there's some hoops to jump through for scale, but we thought it would be helpful enough to show it here. Now, this isn't our take on the scale tool. We've already built what we think is a better mousetrap, so to speak, in the actual CECLSolver. This is faithfully recreated. This is the Fed's math in the scale tool. We just made it more convenient, a little bit easier to use. We provide better and more accessible peer data. So you can, if you're going to try to use a scale tool, the peer data you use is going to drive the entire thing. So it's critical to get good peer data, and the Fed doesn't do a great job of giving it to you in a practical sense. And so that's why we've added that into the tool here. And this is what some of that data looks like. This is just a page coming directly from our QwickAnalytics platform, where you can get a feel for, at some level of granularity, what direction reserves have been headed, by segment. First, again, not for your typical, $1, $2, $300 million community bank, but for the larger $1 to $10 billion super community bank type sizes, and get some sort of idea from a trend perspective as to where reserves have been over the last couple of years. And this can be done at a national level. It can be done at a state level. It can be done at a custom level. So you can track the geographic areas that matter to you from a reserve perspective.
Yeah, and I would just add there, right? Again, part of the benefit, or at least we see the benefit of the peer data in this in particular, right, is, again, it just gives you a sense of trend, as Steve said, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be overly precise or granular, but at least gives you a sense of where these $1 to $10 billion banks feel like risk is going, either it's trending the same or going higher or lower, which in and of itself is a valuable piece of information, right? So I think that's why we're such big believers in peer data, is that it just gives you, again, a objective sense of where the rest of the industry actually feels their risk is, right? It might not be relevant to you. You might feel yours is different from that, but it is still a very good, comprehensive, objective piece of information. All right. Steve, we got a couple of questions. I don't want to make them wait any longer, so I'm just going to jump in here before we talk about the Q factors. So the first question was regarding prepayment speeds for weighted average life. Should we use the contractual wall or the behavioral wall as input to the CECL calculation?
So I'm going to speak loud because the leaf blowers are right next to the window now.
We can hear you fine. We can hear you fine.
You can hear me great. Okay, excellent. So we need to be careful with our terminology, because there's a lot of different. There's while technically speaking, WAL is weighted average life, which technically speaking should mean entire lives, from birth to death, from origination until the end of a loan, whether it's paid off or prepaid or contractually ended. What we're looking for when we're calculating CECL, well, what the requirement is for CECL is that you're trying to estimate losses over the remaining life of the loans. Not just, it's a contractual life, but it's a contractual life adjusted for any reasons we'd have to believe that it wouldn't last as long as, to the contractual maturity. So we do want to take into account we need to take into account prepayment assumptions when we're doing our WARM calculations. We are not to be taking into account renewal, but it's just for the contractual length of the term, less any prepayments that we expect. WAL, weighted average life. Now, colloquially, a lot of times people talk about that, and what they really mean is WARM, right? Weighted average remaining maturity. What we want to find is the average remaining likely maturity. But a lot of times they'll use the term WAL when they really mean WARM. Just make sure that if you're doing a calculation, or if you're getting it from your core, that they're giving you a remaining maturity of the loans on the book, not an average length of an entire new loan from that bucket, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks. And the second question is, from what you've seen thus far with other clients, can you comment on whether a full scale model validation utilizing model risk management guidelines versus a scaled back verification of the model is needed? I'll take a quick crack at this, Steve, and you can follow up with it. So, technically our CECLSolver is a tool more so than a model. The big distinction being that if it's a model, there's reliance on assumptions that need to be back tested and validated. Our CECLSolver doesn't necessarily make any assumptions. We are calculating based on actual information. So in discussion with our auditors and multiple auditors for that matter, it was determined that, a SOC 1 was the appropriate, testing or review for ours, because what we really want to focus in on and kind of warrant to you is that the tool is working the way it should. We have internal controls in place to manage the data and manage changes, And it's really as, kind of a function to make sure we're producing the information as we purport it to. So Steve, do you want anything to add there?
No, I think that's exactly accurate, right? Our tool doesn't have a bunch of mathematical assumptions that we're making in a black box. Our tool is doing calculations properly and putting front and center the assumptions that you are to be making as a management team. All those subjectivities in CECL are what you should be spending your time on, not crunching the historical numbers, but focusing on the qualitative factor adjustments and your narrative around why your reserve is where it is. That's really where a management team should be spending its time, and using our tool. It's designed to allow you to spend your time there as opposed to crunching the historical math, so to speak.
And just a reminder, our SOC 1 is found under the CECL resources tab. So
Yep.
We had one done last year. We have one upcoming in November. But you can find a link to that under our CECL resources tab up in the blue button in the right-hand corner of the homepage. The next question is, do you recommend listing all loans that are currently evaluated for impairment on the individually assessed loan section, regardless of if any specific allocation exists? I think the question here is there's no right answer, right? It's really your culture and however you want to present that, internally and externally, right? So we see banks list them out individually, as you've suggested here. We see banks list them out by the call report pool level that we've established within CECLSolver. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. I think the right way is however you feel best captures what you're trying to display, because I think the important part here is, you're partially doing this for, third parties, whether it be your board, whether it's an auditor or regulator. And so, I think, leaving more breadcrumbs, if you will, is always better. But again, I think, internally in your, kind of your culture and how you want to present this, I think that's the right way to do it. We do see, banks handle this, in a myriad of different ways. And so I don't necessarily know there's a right or wrong way. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think we see it handled in a lot of different ways because there hasn't been great guidance as to what's going to be, the most comfortable, the way that they're going to be most comfortable with moving forward. So people frequently ask us, well, what's the threshold by which we should be splitting loans out of the collective pools and dealing with them on a one-off basis? And unfortunately, there is no consensus as to what that threshold is. We know it's not the old threshold of the TDR because we're going to stop reporting the TDRs on the call report starting next year completely. We know it's not exactly the old impairment threshold because the old impairment threshold was written with FASB's FAS 5 and FAS 114 as our guidance for general and specific reserves, but FAS 5 and FAS 114 are being replaced with the CECL standard that you're complying with starting next January. So it's some murky waters as to when we need to individually assess the loan. So, I would suggest a relatively high threshold to begin with, but we're going to have to, it's going to be some trial and error till we get a balance there. Technically speaking, all the loans, the good loans, the bad loans, the ugly loans, all of them are taken into account in the historical analysis, right? When we do the historical loss rates by call report segment, we're not just doing it on the past pool or the past portfolio, right? We're doing it on your entire loan portfolio. So a lot of the loans that were problematic in the past that you might have had impaired in the past, though some losses for those are already built into the tool historically. And we want to make sure we're not spending too much time double counting losses moving forward. But there certainly is a threshold to meet where individual loans just don't have the same risk characteristics of any other loan in your portfolio, right? If it's a mortgage loan that's in default and foreclosure is imminent and you have a good idea of what that loss might be, if any, those types of loans, we still need to be splitting off individually.
So we have another question, and do you have any recommendations for a bank with limited call report information due to a conversion and WARMs that extend past the available call report information? So I'm assuming this is more of a merger type, but I would think we would still have some historical call report information to grab hold of, Steve? What are your thoughts here?
Well, we would, that's sort of a, would have to be dealt with on a one-off basis, from our solution standpoint, because, by default, you, or our tool, it's going to connect to your current institution and look back at your current call reports. If you acquired another institution, or depending upon the actual transaction, you'd either just look at call reports for another institution and sort of merge them together. But sometimes, depending upon if it was a merger transaction, you're going to have different accounting for the acquired loans to begin with. So we'd want to find out more about that specific situation, I think, before commenting on the roadmap.
Yeah, I think exactly right. Joshua, if you want to reach out to Steve or myself, we're happy to, kind of talk through that. But I think, yeah, we probably want to get a little bit of information, because typically in a merger, this question comes up quite a bit. And our position is that, the surviving bank is really the surviving credit culture that's going to survive. And so the loss history for the surviving bank or the acquiring bank, is probably, the irrelevant historical loss information that we would continue to utilize in CECLSolver. And so that's the typical scenario we see, where the acquisition takes place. And so we feel like that's easily addressed. But we want to make sure we're getting to the heart of your question. So again, potentially just reach out to Steve or me, and we can try to
which does bring up another point. In a more general sense, what if it's a de novo institution, right? What if you have an institution that simply doesn't have history beyond 4 years ago or 5 years ago because the institution didn't exist? That's been a limitation with the way the tool has been designed, but it's one that we're working on solving currently, where we're going to give some more flexibility in look back periods, even look back periods that are shorter than your duration, right? If you have 4 years worth of total history, but you have a warm of 6 years, how to manage that. And we can talk through that on a one-off basis with you as well, if it has to do with a de novo situation. From a general sense, we're going to rely even more heavily on peer data, right? Even if we did have 6 years of data, your first 6 years, you don't have a mature portfolio. Your warms aren't going to look the same. Your loss experience isn't going to be the same. But going forward, your projections, you're going to want to be more in line with a mature portfolio. So we're really going to put a lot of emphasis on the peers' experience more so than your own experience. And again, all these are different conversations depending upon the actual scenario, but ones that we're certainly willing and happy to have.
Yeah, I think the peer data, that's a perfect example of why the peer data is available as a supplemental piece of information. Okay, so I thought we got another question here. Let me just take this one real quick. Yeah, so this was, Joshua, thank you. So this is more pointed to the phase out of the OTS in 2011 and the move to the OCC, right? So yeah, so you began filing the call report in 2012. And so, yeah, again, I think typically, that still provides you with almost a decade worth of loss experience.
A little more than a decade, yeah.
Yeah.
So
typically most of your warms probably will fall under that with any kind of reasonable, prepayment assumption. But yeah, that's exactly the scenarios Steve's talking about, where we'll break and expand that. And so that'll be something that we'll have an update to later this year or early part of next year. But Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything that you
specifically with regards to that. The first thing I would check very carefully is that if you've got any warms that are in excess of 11 years, you should be being very careful to make sure that that's an accurate calculation and has a good prepayment assumption, because even a portfolio of nothing but 30-year mortgage loans, it has, after taking into account prepayments, and a typical remaining life of 5, 7, 8 years. So if you've got warms of 11, 12, 13, my suspicion is we should be looking at prepayment and warm calculations more carefully. But if it were to be 100% accurate, then yeah, we could talk with you about how we would take, the 11 years worth of data and turn it into an appropriate lifetime 12 or 13-year calculation. But that's a relatively limited situation at this point, now that we have 11 full years worth of call report data on even the OTS thrips.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so we've been discussing this for quite a few months. The changes are finally in here for the Q factor details. Steve, anything you want to just touch on here?
Nope, it just goes back to, a lot of our users found that they were they were typing in all these suggested qualitative factors that come from the interagency regulatory guidance that we've had for decades now. And could we just sort of, pre-plug them in there, so to speak, and allow people to remove them if they're not applicable, as opposed to having to go and add them all. So it's more of a, not a big structural change, more administrative, but all those suggested Q factor adjustments are in there by default now. You see all those little red trash cans on the top of the columns. You can remove them at will. So you certainly don't have to make an adjustment based upon changes in lending policies and procedures. If you don't have one, you can simply remove it. Or you can change the column header, the label. You can click right on it and modify the label right in there, and add custom ones. So yeah, just a little bit of more granularity there that we'd been asked about.
Yeah, and so, yeah, certainly appreciate any feedback anybody has on that, but that update is, we appreciate your patience. That update is finally out there.
And that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, just a reminder again, many of these, as Steve touched on, are the Q factors that most of you have used in some form or fashion or in some combination in the ALLL. These will continue to be perfectly appropriate for CECL. And so we've listed those out just in case you are looking for, potentially new Q factors to consider. Steve, anything you want to add here?
Nope.
Okay. Let me see. We got a quick question here in the chat. Yeah, so we're going to show that previous screen past here. Hi, Mustafa. Thanks for joining us today. And then, again, this when you click on your Q factor tab within CECL, you should see those out here. And then again, a listing of the ones that are commonly used in the ALLL today.
Yep.
And can be used going forward with CECL. Okay, so as Steve and I were planning for this month's presentation, again, I think what I've begun to see in discussions and when reviews with banks as we go through their CECL numbers, are a couple of recurring questions, a few right off the top. But one most popular has been just exactly how are we calculating these losses, right? If you think about one of the fundamental differences between the ALLL and what we're doing in CECL is ALLL was focused much more heavily on annual net losses in a much shorter typical window. Some banks may have gone out to 5 years, but for a lot of banks, they were looking at annualized or 1, 2, 3 year types of loss ratios. And CECL, we're looking at, again, in our case, over the remaining life or maturity of a portfolio. So I thought it would be helpful for Steve just to kind of talk through our calculations.
Yeah.
Just so you have an understanding of that, and if you're asked how this is being calculated, you'll have something. Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mustafa, I see your follow-up question. We'll get back to that in as soon as we finish this topic here. So under the the different methodologies that have been vetted and sort of approved for CECL compliance, the WARM method, a lot of the times that you see the WARM method presented, what you see is an annual loss rate, an average annual loss rate that then gets multiplied by the WARM. So no matter how we're going about it, the goal here is to get lifetime historical loss rates. And so a lot of times people look at our tool and say, well, if you go to the next slide, Sean, let's just talk the actual numbers. I think that makes the most sense. This is just a little kind of template example that I threw together so we can understand how the math works. Let's say that we're doing this as of the end of last year, and for this particular segment of the portfolio, there's a WARM or average remaining maturity of 3 years, right? Over the last 3 years, your net charge-off ratios have been 53 basis points in 2019, 29 basis points in 2020, and then 17 basis points in 2021. Those are your typical annual net charge-off ratios, right? Sometimes the WARM method, you would see they would take those last few annual net charge-off ratios and average them out. The average of those three is 33 basis points. So that's an annual average net charge-off ratio. And then you would take that and multiply that by the WARM of 3 years to get a 99 basis point lifetime loss rate. Okay, that's methodology A. Our methodology is a little bit more precise than that, actually. And I'll tell you why we think it's better, but it's very similar. What we're doing, instead of taking each of the years, averaging them, and then multiplying it by the WARM to get a lifetime loss rate, we are simply recalculating a net charge-off ratio using all of the data. So in those 3 years, your net charge-offs in dollars were 500, 300, and 200 for a total lifetime net charge-offs of 1,000 or 1 million here if we're talking in thousands. Now you see the balances and then you see the average balances. So the average balance over the entire life of the loan over that entire 3-year period is 105 million. So we recalculate an aggregate lifetime loss rate is total losses over the entire period, 1 million, divided by average balance over the entire period, 105 million. So 95 basis points. So we're getting to the same concept of that 95 basis points. That's not going to pair up with any of your individual year net charge-off ratios, right? Because it is a 3-year aggregate net charge-off ratio is really what it is. And the reason there's a slight difference between the first methodology, averaging the 3 annual years and then multiplying by 3, and then our recalculation using all the data, there's a 4 basis point difference there. Ours is actually a better way to do it. And the reason is when you're averaging 3 years of historical data or of 3 years of historical net charge-off ratios, you're giving them equal weight, right? So in 2019, you had 53 basis points and then 29 and then 17. But those net charge-off ratios are on a basis of 100 million in loans in 2019, 110 million in 2020, and then 120 million in 2021. So if you take a simple average of those 3 net charge-off ratios, then you're not giving any additional weight to the larger portfolio that you have more recently. So while it's not inaccurate, it's more simplistic. A more accurate way to calculate it is taking the aggregate losses over the entire period and dividing it by the average balance over the whole period. So you're recognizing that you see ours is 4 basis points lower because in 2021 you had the lowest net charge-off ratio and it was based upon the highest balance of loans. So you get some credit for having a lower loss rate with a larger portfolio. So it's kind of ends up being almost more of a weighted average, right, than a straight average. I hope that kind of sheds some light and clarification on why our loss rate might not be calculated as an average of the annuals then multiplied by the WARM.
Yeah, and I think again, this will be a topic that we continue to discuss. But again, I think what we feel like a pivot's going to come in these coffee talks to more things like this as you potentially might get questions, be it from your auditor, from your regulator, even your board. How is this calculated? We thought this would be a helpful way for you just to understand the difference, because this is probably the single biggest or most frequent question we've certainly entertained in the last 30 or 45 days. And so we thought it would be helpful for Steve just to kind of talk through this. And so, we'll probably cover this in future ones as well, but at least we wanted to get the conversation started so you could, have an understanding on how this is calculated. Just to go back to Mustafa's questions and actually a follow-up from David.
Why don't we share my screen while we do that, Sean? Can we, you comfortable switching over to me for a second?
Sure. Let me just stop and then you can take it.
All right.
Although I lose the chat. So the questions are in the, oh no, I got them. They're over here. Never mind. Just, I think the easy thing, David said we didn't have to do this, but Steve, this is something you and I discussed, and David, this is something we have discussed about adding a Q factor column and, or be able to, it says it'd be nice to be able to add comments for each Q factor column in each row. And so we do have over here to the right, we do have your description, so you can do that. So for each of those, you should be able to make those.
Yeah, I think so. These notes are by segment, right? You're making notes about all the adjustments you're making to your mortgage loans, all the adjustments all the assumptions that go into the adjustments to your C&I portfolio. It sounds like he was asking more of a, can we make some notes on, all the Q factor adjustments for lending policies and procedures? So it's sort of a notes column that's at the bottom of each column as opposed to each row. It's a good point. the way I would suggest to handle it for now, is when you're finished with this scenario, export it to Excel. The Excel export allows you to do whatever you want to, right, in an Excel environment. So if I come here and, I make some, some adjustments here. I'm just going to make some random adjustments throughout the tool here with, and then I'm going to export the tool, and I'm going to export the Q factor information into an Excel environment, and it'll pop up right here. And here we go. So this is where those notes would be if you already made them by segment. You could simply come right down here and add some notes by, for each column, for each different Q factor adjustment. And it's not necessarily ideal, but until we'll see how we can build that into the interactive tool. It's a good point. But at least for now, the Excel environment export allows you a way around to get to the same point.
Yeah, and it does kind of illustrate one of the challenges we have is these are all great suggestions. And making the changes on the screen is one challenge, and then trying to kind of fit it to either a PDF or Excel is an equally and sometimes often larger challenge, just because of the real estate on a potential sheet of paper. So we will certainly take that into account and see if there's further enhancements we can make there.
Yeah, it's definitely the PDF export is the challenge, because
Is the challenge.
there's a physical limitation there, but we don't want to remove the PDF export as an option. Excel is great, but PDFs obviously are really, really practical. So that's how we try to balance those things.
And then going back to Mustafa's second question, are the Q factors being generated by your team based on historical bank and economic data? Those are all going to be unique to your institutions. We're not making any adjustments or comments on the Q factors. That is obviously unique to every institution. One of the things that we do, and Steve and I talked about again this week, is as banks start to file, we'll try to get a sense, into next year, where people are in terms of different Q factors and just kind of where they, kind of any kind of, group information we can put together. We'll try to share that as those come up. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Yeah. So I guess the point of differentiation that we need to make is we're providing the data that will help you defend or justify whatever adjustment you want to make. So if you and this is a great example, a very common situation that probably very many of you on the call have is, if not for your entire portfolio, at least for a particular segment of your portfolio, you have almost no historical loss over any reasonable look back period, right? Let's say you look at your C&I portfolio and you have 0 net charge-offs over the last 7 years, and you only have a WARM of 4 years. We know that we're going to have some reserve for our C&I portfolio, but we also know that we can't use our own history to justify it because it's a bunch of zeros, right? That's where we present the peer data in a perfect and as apples to apples a way as possible, right? That same segment, same geographic area, if you build an intelligent local peer group, and we present you with that peer calculation, but it doesn't automatically change your CECL reserve at all unless and until you come and make a Q factor adjustment based upon it. So if I look at my C&I, let's say that we had 0 basis points and our peers had 19 basis points. Well, I go into the Q factor tab, and in the peer experience, I make let's say a 13 basis point adjustment based upon saying, listen, I've had no losses. I recognize they're out there in the environment around me. I've looked at peer data for C&I loans in my state and realize that there are some losses. And so we're going to make an adjustment, expecting that in the future, we may perform a little bit more in line with our peers than in the past. And it helps us justify or build a narrative around the adjustment, but you are making the adjustments based upon the data that we present and provide. If we were making the adjustment, then that's when it becomes more of a model, and it becomes not your assumptions, but our assumptions. And we don't want our assumptions in your CECL tool, because you're the ones that have to justify them, and they need to be coming from management.
Yeah, and honestly, your situation better than we do, right? And I think that's the, again, I think, again, I've said this to many of you when we've done one-on-one demonstrations. We've tried to keep this, and I'm a simple-minded guy, right? So we've tried not to complicate this. But at the heart of reserves, right, is essentially the sum of your historical losses plus or minus a Q factor. What do those Q factors represent? They represent any quantification or additional risk not captured in those historical numbers. That is totally unique to your institution. And that's really what a Q factor is. It's you have your historical numbers, and as Steve said, if you don't have any losses, then the Q factor comes in to account for some risk. Conversely, if you think things have improved and you want to make a negative adjustment, but all of those are unique to your institution and your lending area. And so we're not best, equipped to do that. You are. And so I think that's the beauty of why, again, the Q factor process in a positive way allows you as a bank to determine, again, what's the appropriate level of reserve, right? Because again, at the heart of reserve management is reserves are designed to cover expected losses. Capital's there for unexpected losses. So you make that determination. You make that determination based on your historical experience, which is as real as you can get, plus or minus anything you see out into the future that you think could impact it. And you kind of mesh that and marry that and compare it to your peers, and you get to a number that makes you, your regulators, your auditors, everybody happy. So that's kind of the, again, my take on the Q factors, but it is going to be, unique to every institution. Okay, Steve, do you want me to take it back?
Sure.
Yeah. So if you want to.
Oh, do I?
Well, yeah, it's probably easier if you
There you
stop
go.
and then I share. Yeah. All right. So let me grab my screen again. And let me just put this back to a slideshow. Bear with me, folks. 1 second. All right. All right. We got another question here. How does the peer data calculate into the CECL calculation? It's as Steve said, right? It's an optional or supplemental piece of information. So it doesn't have to impact your calculations at all if you don't want them to. What we thought they would be worthwhile or useful to have is again, in a couple of different scenarios. One, as Steve said, if you don't have any historical losses, or maybe you're even in net recovery, this gives you an objective piece of information that in the exact same time frame and period that you're considering your loss experience, what did other banks in a peer group you created or use the UBPR or your state or however you want to do it, you can get an apples to apples comparison. So it is there solely for your context, your understanding, your reference. So you don't have to do anything with it, but we just think it's a valuable piece of information that can be used in addition to your historical data. Steve, anything you want to add there?
No, exactly that. It's the peer data does not factor into the calculation at all, except for how you determine you want it to, right? The extent to which you think peer data is relevant, you'll look at the peer data, you'll consider it, and then you'll make an adjustment to your historical loss rate based upon that peer experience. So it's certainly up to you. So there would never be a situation where, you don't know how much the peer data has affected your tool, your calculation, because it wouldn't affect the calculation unless and until you made an adjustment based upon it.
Yeah. And then we had a question again about from Mustafa on the validation. So again, up in the blue button for CECL resources is our VAR report. Again, we have another review coming up in November. And so as soon as we have the results of that, we will make that available. But the one current one that we have is already the link under the CECL resources tab. Okay, so we talked about historical loss calculations. The other thing that I'm oftentimes being asked is, we have within our CECLSolver an other category just because of the changes in the call report over time. But then also we get the question oftentimes that, maybe there's within some of the call report codes, there's further stratifications or subsets that you would like to better define than the call report. Now, we designed this so you could use more pooled information. So again, you don't have to do this, but we do get this question, how do I do this? And so how you do it is to potentially provide more loan level information. The easiest way for us to assist with that is to, have you send us the ILDR file, right? Many of you may refer to this as the flat file or the loan tape or the trial balance or the alert file. With that information, we can help better stratify your portfolio. Understand, if you don't have long-term historical loan level data, you're going to lose some of the history that is available to you through the call report. But nevertheless, this is a question we get, so we can help with that. But we will probably need more information from you, and that will probably start around the ILDR file. So this is, again, something I think that we'll continue to discuss as more scenarios come up. But, I just wanted to touch on it because it has come up a couple of times in the last 30 days with banks when we were doing the reviews. And it's often, again, where maybe it's whether it's in the other portfolio or oftentimes in the mortgage portfolio, where you just may have a different subset that is where the risk is, and the bank wants to break that apart. You don't have to do this, but it is if you want to. Like I said, it will require more loan level information. This is an example of the ILDR file. This is what you typically provide to your regulators when they come in for an exam. So it should be something that is familiar to your IT team. That's why we use it, because it's hopefully something new it's not something new you have to generate. It should be something that's probably already available from your core system, as this has been a standard file for nearly 20 years. So, and it does bring up a point though. This is an 82 field file, a number of different things. Some of these you may not complete, but I think it is the lesson going forward. More information into your core is going to give you a better opportunity to create more granular information. Okay, next up, again, prepayment assumptions are probably the third most popular question when we're doing reviews. I think the point we want to make here as we get into this a little bit, and Steve has done a nice job the last couple of coffee talks talking about some additional ways to think about the prepayment assumptions. I think the fundamental rule, again, you want to remember, the higher the prepayment assumption, the lower the WARM, right? The lower the prepayment assumption, the higher the WARM, right? So just by definition, the more conservative approach is a lower prepayment assumption. This, and my concern here, reason why we wanted to have discussed this and ask Steve to put some information on this, is we don't want you to go down rabbit holes that aren't necessarily going to benefit you in your analysis. It is important to have a prepayment assumption. I'm not sure how important it is to be absolutely precise, right? You could get to those numbers, but let's remember CECL is going to be a process. So this is something we can fine tune going forward, but some supportable and defendable prepayment assumption is really where I think most of you want to start. Steve, anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, that's exactly right. Even we see we see institutions sometimes spend a huge amount of resources trying to if they can't simply ask their core processor for a prepayment speed study, they're trying.
Oh, Steve just froze.
It's a level more complicated than more complex than doing a WARM calculation, right? A weighted average remaining maturity calculation, all you really need is balance data and maturity date information for the portfolio. And you can do it just based upon call report buckets. Prepayment calculations mean you have to track individual loans, and you can't just take, your C&I portfolio as of 12/31 this year, and then whatever your call report balance was a year later and do some math to get a prepayment. You'd actually have to follow all the individual loans, because you don't want to track loans that have come into the pool. And so it's a more complex thing to do, and it's more difficult with loan level data for most community banks to handle. And even if you did do all that, even if you spent a huge amount of time and you've calculated, you said over the last 6 months, our annualized prepayment speed on our C&I loans is 14.3%. Unfortunately, that's still not the number you should be using, because they're not asking for a historical prepayment calculation. They're asking you for a forward-looking prepayment assumption. What prepayments do you expect moving forward? So that even all that math and data still doesn't get you to the finish line. And I would say what it is at any one individual point in the past is less relevant and less defensible than what long-term trends have been. So unless you can, magically guess the future with a high degree of accuracy, we're going to want to look at a long-term trend or a long-term average in prepayment rates, in my opinion, as the most defensible. It just so happens to be the easiest way to get it as well, right? So if you flip to the next page, and a question just came in that I'm going to address right now because this is the time to address it.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yep.
Yeah. So, or just leave it if you can. Here, that's all right. Where
Pull
was
back
it?
up.
I got it. Don't move anything. I've got it where it is. So we looked for some guidance, right? Some industry type guidance on prepayment information. The most relevant for mortgage related loans is coming from the FHFA. They put out what they call a prepayment monitoring report, pretty well aptly named, every quarter. Surprisingly, very difficult to find on their website and not very well advertised, but it's there. It's a really good resource for looking at trends in prepayment speeds for all Fannie Freddie loans, average for different coupons and mature.
No, I think Steve froze there.
Payments have been over the long run. And the link is right there. This is on our resources tab. So if you're in our CECL tool, you can click right on it. But if you go to the next slide, Sean, you'll see this is kind of the single best individual piece of data that we've found. It's something that they update every quarter. These are the last 5.5 years worth of average annual prepayment rates on mortgage related loans. So you can see prepayments have been as low as 5 to 10% on an annualized basis and as high as 35% just a year and a half ago. But over that entire period, the average is somewhere in that 15 to 20% range. So we think that's a really good defensible starting point for annual prepayment rates for mortgage related loans. The specific question that came in was for prepayment data, should we be using CPR, SMM, or PSA? So those, if you're not familiar with those terms, CPR stands for constant or conditional prepayment rate. I've seen it both ways. SMM is single monthly mortality, and PSA is a standard, is an old school standard by which prepayments have been judged as compared to a large kind of old industry norm. And PSAs of 100%, for example. And then they're shown in percentages, right? What 100% would be like a 7%, whereas a 200 PSA would be more like 14%. What we're looking for is CPR. So that, and you'll hear it a lot of the times, it's called 1 month CPR, but it's still an annualized number, whether it's a 1 month CPR, 3 month CPR, it's an annualized number no matter what. So you can't go wrong with that because we're trying to take our WARM calculations and adjust them for an annualized prepayment rate. So you're using the CPR in our WARM estimator. We have an Excel-based tool. Most of you are probably familiar with it, called our WARM estimator. It just shows you how you would calculate the WARM and how you would affect it by a prepayment rate in order to comply with CECL. And that's an Excel file that's free for anyone to utilize on our site. But yeah, you're looking for an annualized CPR for CECL purposes. It's a good question. You could do SMM, single monthly mortality, but you'd want to annualize that anyway. So the trick is to have an annual one and then properly calculate it over a lifetime WARM, and our Excel tool does that. Next question, I'm sure is on everyone's mind is, well, that's helpful for mortgage loans, but what about for everything else? So the easiest is the mortgage. Everything else is a little bit harder to get prepayment, any sort of good, decent guidance on it. But what we were able to find actually came from the Federal Reserve back in after the last credit crisis, and they put together the TALF, or the Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility Program, which is a mouthful. They made a bunch of assumptions or did a big study about what prepayments should be used as they pertain to that facility. And while the TALF is dated as a program, they kept updating a lot of those assumptions on the Federal Reserve's website, the Fed of New York. There's a link there. And at least as of maybe about a year ago or so, they were still updating those assumptions. And so that's a good place to start. It gives you some idea about prepayment assumptions for different types of loans: auto, equipment, small business, student loans. Now you see those, they're a different type of prepayment rate. Those are ABS, which stands for absolute prepayment speed. I know it says B and prepayment starts with the letter P. Your guess is as good as mine why they do that, but it stands for absolute prepayment speed, which is simply what percentage of the loans at the beginning of any given month are paid off before the end of that month. So it's just percentage of the starting number of loans that are prepaid within a monthly period. The difference is it's not annualized by default. So we take that 1.5% monthly ABS and we annualize it, multiplied by 12. It's a simple annualization. And so over the course of a year, that would equate to somewhere around 15 to 20%. It's a complete pure coincidence that the guidance we found for prepayments on other types of loans was pretty close to what it was for mortgage loans, that 15 to 20% kind of range. In our Excel-based tool, we start with 10% across the board. We wanted to be conservative by default. We notate that in the tool. So if you're using our tool and your warm seem a little bit high and you haven't looked at the prepayment numbers that are in the warm tool, go look at them. And if they're all at 10%, strongly consider bumping them up to 15 to 20% using this more updated guidance. And I think you'll see those warms come down by a little bit. And all things being equal, higher prepayment, lower warm, lower CECL reserve, right? Again, CECL's all about losses over the remaining lives of the pools. The longer the pools have a life, the longer they have to aggregate losses over time, right? So that's a way to, if you're finding your CECL reserve higher than expected, the easiest, lowest hanging fruit is make sure you're not shooting yourself in the foot with an underestimated prepayment assumption.
So we had a follow-up question to that, Steve. Anything on, commercial real estate prepays? So, again, I think this is something we continue to monitor. We haven't really found anything to share yet to this point, but it is something we'll continue to seek out. Steve, anything you want to add there?
No, yeah, it's a good question. We haven't specifically found separate data more precise for commercial real estate lending. If anyone has any resources that analyze that and provide good data source for it, we'd love to see it. But maybe it's lucky that everything else, no matter what segment we're using, we're coming out at around 15 to 20%, but probably still a good starting point for the CRE.
Yeah, and this is when we're, again, I just think this is a perfect example of what we, started this conversation on: precision versus accuracy, right? Don't try to be overly precise, because you can, but it's a lot of work, and I'm just not sure it's worth the time and energy that you might spend to do it. A defensible and supportable, reasonable assumption is appropriate. And so, as Steve said, we put in 10%. If you want to adjust those higher or lower, but again, the important thing is the higher the prepayment assumption, the lower the warm's going to be, right? If you want to be more conservative, a lower prepayment assumption, because that's going to mean a longer warm. So you're going to evaluate losses over a period of time. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind as you go through this. So we'll continue to touch on these as we go forward. And again, if we find additional sources or resources, we'll share those with you. And if you certainly have some that you'd like us to review or consider, we're happy to do that as well. A question came on about the recording in the slides. Yes, I did start the recording today, so we should have a link to the recording, and we will send out the slides. It'll probably be on Monday. We might get it later today, but chances are it'll probably be Monday. You'll get an email from us with a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording. Thank you for the kind words there, Lisa. Okay, so let me go back where we were. Oops, we're to the end. Certainly, put forth any other additional questions you'd like to have us address. Next month, October 14th, we'll have another edition of Coffee Talk. As I mentioned at the top, Paul Allen is returning. Paul does a great job. We had a great coffee talk with him earlier this year. He's agreed to come back. and take questions. So we're very excited to have Paul rejoin us. Still, if anyone of you are new and just getting started with CECL, we will have one more webinar here this month on the 20th, where we will go into the tool in greater detail. Certainly at any time, email us, email Ricky, Pam, Melissa, and schedule a time if you want to go through your data. And we're just again, we're going to try to as best we can continue to support your efforts as you make this transition and share what we're learning from our banks as they're working through it, and then share that with you. Let me check for any final questions. Steve, any final comments before we let everyone get to their rest of their day and their weekend?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, we certainly appreciate your time today, as always. We will continue to try to find ways to continue to improve the tool with your feedback. I think importantly, for even these future coffee talks, if there's any specific areas of the tool or just in CECL in general you'd like us to cover, please let us know that, and we will try to make sure we address that in the presented format. And then again, we'll continue to take questions as they arise. So on behalf of Steve, again, thank you very much for your time today, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.